This is Ithaca DSA Presents, and I'm Patricia Rodríguez. And we have the pleasure of having with us today Juan González. He is co-host of Democracy Now!, a columnist for the New York Daily News, winner of the Polk Award for Investigative Reporting, and former president of National Association for Hispanic Journalists. He's in town to present on his book titled News for All the People, which situates race at the center of a sweeping history of U.S. News media. But he's also the author of Harvest of Empire, a history of Latinos in America, and co-producer of Harvest of Empire, a documentary, which was recently shown at Ithaca College, and both events were sponsored by the Park Center for Independent Media. So the interview today will focus mostly on Harvest of Empire, although some on the other book too. Juan González, welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Can you speak a little bit about Harvest of Empire and the link between U.S. policies related to trade and militarization in the region and migration to the U.S.?
Well, I think that the central thesis of Harvest is that you cannot really understand the huge explosion of the Latino population in the United States since World War II without first understanding the role that the United States government and United States business has played in Latin America, going back from the early 1800s, but especially in the beginning of the 20th century. And that, in fact, the Latino presence in America is the unintended harvest of the American empire. Latin America being the incubator for the multinational corporations of the United States that went on to dominate so many other parts of the world. And that, in effect, one is the result of the other. And precisely it's those countries that were most dominated or even invaded by the United States at particular times that have provided the most migrants to the country, whether it's Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and these are the countries that have provided the bulk of the Latino migration to the country. And so what Harvest tries to do is to try to tell the separate stories of each of these nations through the eyes of a particular family or a group of people that were sort of pioneros, the pioneers of that migration, and to sort of tell the personal stories, what was happening in their country before they came here, what propelled them to leave, and what happened when they got here, where did they establish their communities, their networks, and how did they fare within the broader American society, both vis-a-vis African Americans, white Americans, or other Latinos. So it's sort of a look at the personal stories, but within the broader framework of how that particular nationality or group came to the country.
Great. Can you speak a little bit about, within the United States, organizations that deal with this issue of migration? How has that organization happened? What has been like the obstacles to that organization, or promises of it?
And you mean in terms of immigration
Yes.
policy? Well, I think one of the interesting things is that because the Latino experience in America is so diverse, it's as diverse as the original, within the Latino groups, as the original European migrations were, of Poles and Italians and Irish and Germans and Swedes, so that there's a huge difference both in the class character of the Latino migration, some nations producing a more middle class or a more working class migration, but also that the groups settled in different parts of the country. It's been rare that you've had really strong national organizations that go across the ethnic groups. Increasingly, you're seeing some of that, but I think probably over migration, that's produced the most cooperation between the various national groups. And you had, starting at the early at the turn of this latest century, the development of all of these grassroots organizations of immigrant advocacy groups that culminated with the huge immigrant rights protests in 2006, which, you know, I say in my new edition of Harvest of Empire, really 2006 was the seminal moment in the history of the Latino community in the United States, because it was the first time that the Latino community took the center stage of American politics in such huge numbers. And so you had suddenly the largest series of mass protests over any issue in the history of the country occurred between March and May of 2006. And most of it was driven by this coalition of all these small immigrant rights groups all around the country. Yes, there were the big groups, the Catholic Church, the Service Employees International Union, the big immigrant rights groups in Washington, but they didn't bring the people. The people were brought by all of these organizers out in Long Island, in the suburbs of Virginia, in Southern California, and in Colorado, who all decided they were going to join together in opposition to what was then called the Sensenbrenner Bill. And suddenly, out of nowhere, using social media, using Spanish language radio and television, you know, these huge crowds of ordinary working class Latinos appeared in all the major cities of the country and really shocked the nation. And I think everything that's happened since then in political development in Washington really stems from what happened in the spring of 2006.
That's great. So in terms of U.S. policy to Latin America, trade policy particularly, has there been improvements since, you know, you wrote the book in 2000, and from then till now, do you see any improvements happening?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, there's been a huge change in Latin America, I think, which has really fueled the improvement in the change, which is that, and I, again, touch on this in the revised edition that came out in 2011, which is that Latin America has become, over the last decade, the center of democratic reform on the planet. Not just in the West, it's the center of democratic reform in the world right now. In over the last 10 to 12 years, you've had a series of governments come to power in Latin America, populist governments that for the first time are including indigenous and marginalized racial groups and women, and all of the governments have sort of swept aside the neoliberal solutions that emanating from Washington and from the European Union, and sort of have adopted a view of government that government has a role in the social improvement of people's lives. And if you look at the United Nations or economic development reports, Latin America is one of the few regions in the world where the income gap is shrinking between rich and poor. And in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Brazil, in all of these countries, as a result of these popular governments, you're seeing a reduction of inequality. In addition to, it's all happening democratically. It's all happening through the voting process. And I think that that's had an impact, obviously, that fewer Latin Americans feel the need to leave. A lot of people make, especially the Pew Center for Hispanic Studies has made a big deal out of the fact that there's a net outflow from of immigration now from Mexico. More people are going back to Mexico than coming from Mexico. Now, I'm not sure that that is that's as a result all of the economic reforms, because Mexico is one of the few countries that has not had a real populist government take power. But there's no doubt that the region as a whole has had an economic improvement over the last 10 years, and that has slowed some of the migration from Peru, from Colombia, from some of these other countries. And I think that the Mexican situation might be a quirk of the fact that there's been this huge economic recession in the United States and the push to push Mexicans back out, and that Mexico has not been as hard hit by the recession as the United States was. So we have to wait a few more years to see whether that's going to maintain itself. But basically speaking, the changes in Latin America have resulted in greater hope and a reduction of inequality, and I think that's put a downward pressure on migration for the first time, really, in 50 years.
Right. At the same time, though, there has been here in the United States, an increase in deportations, in ICE searches, in separation of families, right?
Yes.
Because of detention, long-term detention, and so how do you like? What do you make of that? With now with Obama's push to have immigration reform, what's happening there?
Well, I think, well, obviously the mass deportations started under Bush but accelerated under Obama, and which shows that they were a bipartisan policy, that there was a feeling, and it's not, I try to stress the fact, this is not the first mass deportation that has occurred in the United States. It is actually, from the Mexican point of view, the third massive deportation. There was a mass deportation under Herbert Hoover in the midst of the Depression of Mexicans. There was a second mass deportation, Operation Wetback, in the 1950s against Mexicans. And so this is the third mass deportation. They usually occur in periods of economic recession or depression in the case of the 1930s, when suddenly there's a huge cry that immigrant labor is competing for American jobs, and there's a call to throw out the Mexicans, because the Mexicans function as a reserve labor force for the American economy. So whenever there is a downturn in the American economy, Mexicans are pushed back out. So I think that what's happened with this mass deportation is precisely that. It is a reflection of the attempt by policymakers to do a quick fix solution to the immediate economic problem, and it feeds off racial, racist attitudes that already exist in society, but ultimately it's counterproductive, because the reality is that the United States, even though it has high unemployment right now, still faces a demographic labor shortage in the future. There are not enough young people in America to maintain all the people that are getting old and getting ready to retire. And so the country is going to need more young workers over the coming decades, not fewer. And they're going to come from Latin America for the most part. So I think that this policy right now is a short-sighted, it's mean, but it won't last, because the economics of the situation require more young workers, not fewer ones.
And so that's what is at the core of immigration reform now?
Well, I think that is, well, no, I don't think the politicians are that far-sighted enough. What's at the core of the immigration reform right now is that the legal Latino voting population has become so huge that, and for the legal Latinos, no matter from what nationality, they feel most strongly the terrible impact of the deportations, because often, you'll have a family where some people are legal citizens but others are not, and so it directly affects families, friends, co-workers, and so Latinos turned out in such huge numbers in the last few elections, and actually it started in 2006, right after the protests, when Democrats won control of the Congress in 2006, and then it continued in 2008, and now especially in 2012. Where the numbers of Latinos has almost doubled each time, so that now it's dawned on everyone that this isn't going to stop, because there's so many young Latinos, citizens, turning 18 every year, that the whole nature of politics in America is going to continue to change. So the Republicans and the Democrats have both said, okay, we got to do something, and especially the Republicans, because they're in danger of imploding as a party, because they're going to become such a minority party unless they change their attitude toward toward Latinos, and win back some of those Latino votes that more moderate Republicans on immigration, like George Bush or Jeb Bush or Reardon in LA or Giuliani in New York, all of whom got about 40% of Latino votes when they ran, because they were much more pro-immigrant than the current Republicans. So I think that that the immediate reason for immigration reform is that the numbers are saying you've got to do it because there's too many Latinos who are voting right now. So I think that's, but the question is going to be really, and I keep repeating this to everybody, is everyone is talking immigration reform, but everyone has a different idea of what it means. And the devil is going to be in the details. And there's all manner of details that are going to be decided, because they are talking comprehensive immigration reform. They're not just talking about the 11 million undocumented. They're talking about how many guest worker farm workers will be admitted, how many guest worker science and technology visas will be allowed, what will be the caps on countries for how many can be legally admitted every year. It's going to be an overall immigration reform. And in each one of these aspects is very complicated. It's all going to, there's going to be major battles over the details of that reform.
At the same time, the U.S. hasn't really let off of the emphasis on militarization. I mean, Colombia, 7 military bases, some new military bases in Chile and in Argentina now. And so what is happening, what's the continued interest of the U.S. in having these military bases?
Yeah, well, there too, there's been, because of these populist governments, it's gotten a little bit more difficult to do it. Well, for instance, I was born in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico used to be nothing but U.S. military bases. As much as 13% of the land of the island used to be military bases. Little by little, they've gotten rid of most of them. And with the battle over Vieques that ended in 2004, the Navy got so angry that it was forced to give up its target practice range in Vieques, that they pulled out the entire Roosevelt Roads Naval Base, one of the biggest naval bases in the world. They pulled it out of Puerto Rico to punish the Puerto Rican people. So that now there's only one major military base left in Puerto Rico, Fort Buchanan, but all the others have been pulled out. So Puerto Rico has been, not completely, but almost demilitarized. And in some other places, some of the, I think in Peru, they took out a military base. But generally speaking, the interest of the United States is still in maintaining ties with the military leaders of those countries, because there's always the hope springs eternal in Washington, that pro-US governments will return to power in Latin America, as they've already done in Chile, so that there is the hope that this wave of populist leaders will end, and they want to maintain those ties to the generals and the colonels and all of these Latin American armies, in waiting for the better times to come.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit about how you see the U.S. media covering Latin America? And then also...
It doesn't. I mean, basically, it doesn't. It rarely does, except to deal with, illegal immigration, and but there's virtually no coverage of Latin America, or occasionally, obviously, the boogeyman of Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro, but for instance, the fact that of all the countries in Latin America who have seen income inequality shrink, Venezuela has had the biggest reduction in income inequality. Virtually no one in the United States knows that, and no one reports it. That the Chavez government has actually used its oil revenues to benefit the people of Venezuela, so there's virtually no coverage of Latin America. And given the enormous importance of the region, especially Mexico. I mean, Mexico, people have no idea. Mexico is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. All right? It far dwarfs the population of Spain. And it is a huge, huge economic trade partner with the United States, and it has a 2,000-mile border, the longest contiguous border in the world between a third world country and an advanced capitalist country. Mexico is enormously important. I mean, half of Mexico is now the United States, or what used to be Mexico is now the United States, and yet we pay almost no attention to U.S.-Mexico policy or give the leaders of Mexico any sort of like general importance vis-a-vis the world leaders. But it's part of the arrogance of the American media not to do adequate reporting even of the country right on our borders.
Most of the coverage of Mexico has to do with the drug war.
With the drug war, yes.
Right.
Yes, and little with the enormous contributions of Mexicans to American prosperity.
And is there any difference in terms of how Latin America covers immigration issues, like Latin American news media? What's the how can you compare U.S. news media, Latin American news media?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of Latin American news media has developed some of the same problems that the American news media have, dominated by a few major, huge media giants, whether it's Televisa or Venevisión in Venezuela or Globo in Brazil, that they really ape a lot of the American media, heavy emphasis on entertainment, less so on news. In Puerto Rico, which I'm much more familiar with, the decline in the quality of journalism in Puerto Rico has been astounding. It used to be that the journalists of Puerto Rico were some of the most politically astute, independent, and investigative. Now they're almost as bad as you would find in any local news station in the United States. So I think that the corporatization of media in Latin America has advanced at a rapid speed. At the same time, though, you have had development of community radio. And for instance, Democracy Now!, we're carried on about 200 stations in Latin America. Our headlines, at least, or portions of our programming are carried on the radio of La Madre de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and community radio in Honduras and in Puerto Rico. So there is a burgeoning community, independent radio and news operations that are occurring. But again, they reach limited numbers of the population compared to the big media giants. But there's hope there that as they grow and as they network and as their capacity becomes greater, that they'll have a bigger impact on larger audiences in the future.
And what has been how do you see the reception of both Harvest of Empire and News for All the People here in the United States among different societal groups and also among politicians?
Well, I think Harvest of Empire, which has been out much longer now, it's been out about 13 years, has actually, I've been surprised by given the sort of radical critique that I present of Latino migration and presence. It's been pretty adopted on a pretty widespread basis. About 200 colleges around the country now have it as a required text, and so it's become one of the most popular sort of general histories or introductory histories of Latinos in the United States. And I get a lot of letters, not just from young Latino students who said, oh, you know, I never knew this about all these other Latino groups. I knew a little bit about my own group, but also I get quite a few letters from ordinary white Americans, politicians have written to me in other parts of the country who suddenly are discovering huge Latino populations in these small towns that they live in that they never understood why, and they happen to find the book in the bookstore, and they thank me for explaining to them, getting them a better understanding of how those folks got there. So I think that it's had a big impact. And I think now the filmmakers were working on it for about 8 years, and it's already had, it's played to very big crowds in New York and LA, but now it opens starting this weekend in theaters around the country. And over the next few months, it'll be in a series of theaters in cities around the country. So hopefully it'll spur a much more nuanced debate and discussion about the origins and the evolution of Latino migration in the country.
And has that been picked up among the political class?
Well, we'll see soon. Hopefully, there's supposed to be a showing in, I think it's March 13th in Washington, D.C., in a downtown theater in Washington, D.C. We'll see how many of the politicians come out. But we did do a screening at the Brookings Institution, which had a huge, very big crowd, and Brookings is more of a sort of moderate think tank. But it got a very, very good reaction at Brookings, and also at the Aspen Institute did a screening late last year as well. They also had a very good response. So among the think tank types, it's gotten a good response. We have to see yet how the politicians deal with it. Yeah.
And in Latin America, has it?
No, it has not opened in Latin America, and in fact, much of the movie is in Spanish with English subtitles because many of the interviews are in Spanish. But there are still big sections. There's a great interview with Rigoberta Menchú in the film, and with some of a victim of torture in El Salvador who became a migrant to the United States. But now the producers want to produce one where there are Spanish subtitles for the English so that they can then market in Latin America as well.
Well, we've come to the end of the program, and I just want to thank you once again for your time and for participating and for being here in Ithaca. So thanks so much.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.